They erased the maps, burned the records, silenced the builders. But a hidden order stayed behind, watching ruined cities, impossible architecture, and secrets older than modern history. If Tartaria really existed, these guardians were its last shield, and they're still guarding something, the name that floated over maps. European maps from the early modern period sometimes place a single word across a very wide stretch of northern and inner Asia. Tartary, or Tartaria. The label does not describe one fixed political state. It shifts from map to map, and it can sit over different regions depending on the cartographer and the moment. The Library of Congress has noted that Tartary appears on European and American maps for centuries, and that its position is not consistent across different examples. In that same period, the ground beneath the ink was managed through borders, outposts, and garrison routines, rather than through a single shared administration. The work of controlling movement across long distances was done by small units, stationed in places that were easy to defend and hard to avoid. Those stations were not called guardians in official paperwork. They were forts, border posts, customs points, and walled towns where documents were checked, goods were counted, and names were copied into registers. Across the northeast, the Russian state and the Qing Empire reached formal agreements that turned contested spaces into surveyed lines. The Treaty of Nerchinsk was signed in August of 1689, after fighting in the Amur region and the Qing siege of Albazin. It is described as the first treaty between the two states, and it established a border framework that lasted until the mid-19th century. Negotiations involved Fyodor Golovin on the Russian side and Songgotu on the Qing side, and the treaty text existed in multiple languages used for diplomacy at the time. A second major arrangement followed in the next century. The Treaty of Kyakhta is dated to the late 1720s, and it regulated relations and trade along the frontier. It is associated with the border town of Kyakhta and with the establishment of managed caravan trade, including the exchange of Russian furs for Chinese tea. It also fixed parts of the border through markers and agreed procedures for border administration. On a calm day at a border town, the practical meaning of such treaties could be seen in simple movements. A gate opens at a set hour. A clerk takes down a name, often more than once, because spellings differ across languages and scripts. An interpreter repeats a sentence until both sides agree that it matches the intended meaning. A seal is pressed into wax or inked onto paper. The person carrying a bundle waits while the record is made. Farther west and south, other defensive systems predate those treaties and continue beside them as parallel lines of control. In northern China, the Ming period organized Great Wall defenses into zones administered through garrisons. Reference works describe a Ming arrangement of 9 defense areas, each with a senior post responsible for a section and its supporting network. These were not symbolic structures, they were paired with command hierarchies, supply needs, and long-term stationing of troops near key passes. The daily labor of a garrison does not look dramatic. A watch schedule is posted. Repairs are ordered for a weakened section of earthwork. Grain deliveries are checked against the expected weight. A courier arrives with a small packet and a date written on the outside. Even the idea of defense can be mostly administrative. A closed gate can be as effective as a weapon when it is backed by a rule that is applied the same way each week. In the middle of the 18th century, the Qing state extended and reorganized control in regions now commonly discussed as Xinjiang, with military and administrative structures placed over areas north and south of the Tian Shan. After the final stages of the Dzunga-Qing Wars in the late 1750s, the Qing established the office known as the General of Ili in 1762, based at Huiyuan. Descriptions of the post emphasize its combined military and administrative jurisdiction in the region. A line of authority like that depended on specific places. A headquarters town becomes a center for orders and reports. Subordinate officials manage affairs across a spread of settlements, with responsibilities divided by circuit and by direction. The arrangement is recorded in institutional terms, but it implies a map of roads, relay stations, and guarded storehouses. In the Russian Empire's southern and southeastern borderlands, the 18th century brought fortified lines and new towns meant to control passage between settled districts and steppe regions. Scholarship on the Orenburg borderlands describes a fortified line along the Yaik River in in the 1730s and 1740s, turning it into a hard border separating Russian-controlled areas from steppe territories to the south. The language in such studies is not mystical. It focuses on lines, forts, and the people whose roles emerged around them. These systems placed ordinary individuals into repetitive positions that could last for years. A soldier stands in cold weather at a post that looks across flat land with no clear end. A mounted patrol measures distance by habit. A storekeeper counts iron tools and keeps a list of what is missing. A local guide is hired for knowledge of a river crossing, and that knowledge becomes part of a state routine. A priest, merchant, or translator lives near a border town because the work requires continuity. The word Tartaria on a map can appear to cover all of this at once, as if the label itself were a coherent unit. Modern map history writing is careful about that impression. The Library of Congress account of the term points out that it was used across centuries, and that later maps replace it with more specific political or regional labels, such as Turkestan, Mongolia, or Manchuria, or identify the areas as parts of large empires. For a viewer trying to keep the records separate from later storytelling, the safest approach is to treat Tartary as a moving exonym, and then to look at what can be pinned to dates and places. Nerchinsk in 1689 is a real negotiation site with named negotiators and a stated purpose. Kyakhta in the 1720s is a real border town associated with regulated trade and frontier rules. Huiyuan and the office of the General of Ili are concrete institutional facts tied to a year and a seat of command. The pattern across these examples is procedural. Borders are stabilized through paper, markers, and posted authority. Garrisons exist to keep watch and to enforce routine. Fortified lines do not need constant fighting to have an effect, because their main function is to make certain movements predictable and others difficult. The phrase, last line of defense, can sound like a single dramatic boundary. The historical record shows many lines, built at different times for different reasons, each staffed by people whose names were often less important than their role. A guard in a tower, a clerk at a gate, and a commander signing a treaty can all be part of the same slow structure, even when the map above them carries a vague label that will not survive into modern usage. Stones that could not be moved. Borders become real when they are fixed to something that resists change. In early modern Eurasia, that resistance was often provided by stone, wood, or earth, placed deliberately into the landscape. Treaties might define a line in words, but the line only gained practical force when it could be located again months or years later by people who had not been present at the signing. After the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689, Russian and Qing officials were tasked with translating written clauses into physical reference points. Contemporary descriptions note that rivers, mountain ridges, and watersheds were favoured because they were already visible and difficult to dispute. Where such features were unclear, markers were installed. These could be stone cairns, posts, or inscribed tablets. They functioned as evidence that a boundary had been agreed upon and observed. The Amur Basin provided a testing ground for this approach. The region had seen conflict in the years before Nerchinsk, particularly around Albazin. Once the treaty was concluded, the priority shifted from conquest to definition. Officials from both sides travelled through the terrain to identify the features named in the agreement. Interpreters were present because the treaty existed in multiple languages, and each version had to correspond to the same ground reality. A misread river bend could undo months of negotiation. Markers placed in this period were often simple. A pile of stones arranged by hand, a wooden post driven into soil and marked with characters, a note in a register describing distance from a recognizable landmark. Their durability varied. Wood decayed. Stones could be scattered. This meant that boundary maintenance became an ongoing task rather than a single event. The Treaty of Kyakhta, concluded in the 1720s, expanded this practice into a more regulated system. Kyakhta itself became a fixed point, with customs, buildings, and checkpoints that formalized the crossing process. From there, boundary lines extended outward, marked at intervals agreed upon by both empires. Surviving records describe joint patrols that inspected markers and confirmed their condition. When a marker was missing or damaged, it was replaced according to protocol rather than unilaterally altered. In this system, the act of maintenance mattered as much as initial placement. A stone that remained upright signaled continuity. Its presence indicated that the treaty still held. The absence of a marker did not automatically change the border, but it created uncertainty that officials were instructed to resolve quickly. Reports were written, seals were applied, and replacement dates were recorded. Further south, along the Qing frontier, in regions later administered under the General of Ili, similar methods were applied after the mid-18th century. The defeat of the Dzungar Khanate did not end with military withdrawal. It was followed by the installation of administrative circuits and the fixing of outer limits. Documents from this period describe boundary stones placed at mountain passes and along routes used by herders and traders. These stones bore inscriptions identifying jurisdiction and warning against unauthorized movement. The placement of such markers required local knowledge. Guides familiar with seasonal changes were consulted, because a pass accessible in summer could be impassable in winter. Rivers could shift course after floods, raising questions about whether the border followed the old channel or the new one. In response, officials often specified that the boundary followed the main channel as recognized at the time of marking, and any major change would require consultation rather than assumption. On the Russian side, fortified lines constructed in the 18th century incorporated boundary markers into broader defensive planning. Along the Orenburg line, for example, forts were spaced at measured intervals, and the spaces between them were not left undefined. Markers indicated patrol zones and areas of responsibility. A soldier standing watch did not guard an abstract frontier. He guarded a segment defined by distances recorded in official instructions. These instructions emphasized measurement. Distances were calculated in versts or li, depending on administrative tradition. Surveyors used chains, pacing, and reference stars to keep records consistent. The resulting maps were working documents. They were updated when errors were discovered, but the underlying assumption remained that the border was something that could be checked against physical points. The map labeled Tartary persisted through these developments, especially in European atlases that were removed from local administration. While borders were being fixed on the ground, the label continued to float over large areas in printed form. This contrast did not trouble officials responsible for enforcement. Their authority derived from stones they could touch, not from names printed far away. A boundary marker also functioned as a legal object. In disputes involving herders crossing with livestock or traders moving goods, the location of the marker could determine jurisdiction. Court records from frontier regions refer to distances from known stones or posts when assigning responsibility. The marker thus became part of routine legal language. Markers were not always respected. Weather, human interference, and shifting use of land could compromise them. In response, both empires developed inspection schedules. Officials traveled along the border at set intervals, noting conditions and confirming positions. These journeys were slow and repetitive. They generated paperwork rather than dramatic encounters. In northern China, sections of the Great Wall served a similar purpose. Though on a larger scale, the wall itself was a continuous marker, but it was supplemented by inscribed stones indicating command jurisdictions and repair responsibilities. A tower belonged to a unit. A stretch of wall was assigned to a garrison. These assignments were recorded so that accountability could be maintained over time. The emphasis across these systems was on continuity. A marker was expected to remain in place across generations. Its presence allowed people who had never met to agree on where a line lay. This reduced the need for constant negotiation. When disputes did arise, the first step was often to locate the nearest recognized marker and work outward from there. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, European travelers moving through Central Asia sometimes commented on these stones and posts. Their travel accounts note inscribed markers encountered along routes, often without understanding their administrative significance. To the traveler, the stone was an object of curiosity. To the states that placed it, it was part of a long-term system of control. The historical record does not present these markers as symbols of a single unified civilization. They appear instead as tools used by multiple states operating in overlapping regions. The continuity lies in method rather than ideology. Define the line. Mark it. Record it. Inspect it again. Stones set into the ground. Posts driven into soil. Walls repaired section by section. They did not speak. They did not move. Their role was to stay where they were placed and to be found again when needed. Routes that required permission. Movement across long distances in Inner Asia was rarely free, even in periods remembered for open steppe travel. By the 17th and 18th centuries, most established routes were tied to systems of permission. Roads, river passages, and mountain passes were treated as administrative corridors. Access depended on documents rather than on speed or force. Along the Russo-Qing frontier established by the Treaty of Kyakhta, regulated movement became a routine feature of border life. The town of Kyakhta itself functioned as a controlled gateway. Merchants arriving from either side were required to present papers identifying their origin, cargo, and destination. These documents were checked against registers maintained by local officials. The process emphasized consistency. Caravan trade between Russia and Qing China followed fixed schedules. Historical records describe caravans departing at approved times, traveling in groups, and stopping at designated stations. Tea caravans moving north from China were subject to inspection at multiple points. Loads were counted and weighed. Any discrepancy was noted before onward travel was allowed. The route itself became predictable, not because of geography alone, but because permission structured its use. Permits were often specific. A document might allow travel along one road but not another, or grant access only as far as a named town. The wording mattered. Officials compared seals and handwriting to known examples. Forged or altered papers could result in detention, fines, or forced return. These outcomes are recorded in administrative correspondence rather than in narrative accounts, reflecting their routine nature. In Qing-administered regions west of the Gobi, especially after the establishment of the General of Ili in 1762, similar systems applied. Travelers moving between oasis towns required travel passes issued by local authorities. These passes listed the bearer's name, status, and purpose. They also specified duration. Overstaying without renewal could trigger investigation. The pass thus linked movement to time as well as to space. Routes through mountain passes were particularly regulated. Passes controlled access between ecological zones and administrative districts. Guards stationed at these points checked documents and recorded passage. The guard's task was not to assess intent but to verify conformity. If the paper matched the person and the route, passage continued. If not, the matter was referred upward. River travel followed comparable rules. Ferries across major rivers operated under license. Boat operators were accountable for who they carried. Records from frontier regions mention ferrymen questioned after unauthorized crossings. Responsibility extended beyond the traveler to those who enabled movement. This shared accountability reduced informal passage over time. On the Russian side, fortified lines such as the Orenburg Line were intersected by controlled crossings. Gates and checkpoints were placed where roads met the line. Travelers approaching from the steppe encountered inspection before entry into settled districts. Officials noted not only goods but also the direction of travel. Movement outward and inward were treated differently, reflecting concerns about trade, security, and taxation. Cossack units played a role in these systems, particularly as escorts and patrols. Their presence along routes reinforced the expectation that travel occurred under observation. Patrol logs describe routes covered and encounters with travelers. The language is procedural. Names, dates, and outcomes are listed without commentary. The purpose was record-keeping rather than storytelling. Permission systems extended beyond commerce. Pilgrims, envoys, and messengers also carried documents. Diplomatic envoys traveled with letters that identified them and outlined their authority. These letters were presented at each jurisdictional boundary. Delay was common, especially when verification was required. The route itself became segmented into approved stages. Local populations adapted to these constraints. Communities located near checkpoints or passes developed services aligned with regulated travel. Inns, stables, and markets appeared where travelers were required to stop. These sites became predictable nodes in larger networks. Their existence depended less on natural convenience than on administrative placement. Maps produced for officials reflected this reality. Routes were drawn not as open lines but as sequences of stops. Distances were measured between checkpoints rather than between cities alone. Instructions accompanying maps emphasized adherence to approved paths. Deviating from the route, even when terrain allowed, was discouraged because it bypassed oversight. The persistence of the broad label Tartary on European maps did not alter these practices. Travelers entering the region encountered layered controls regardless of the name applied from afar. A merchant from Kazan or a trader from Gansu navigated a series of permissions that defined movement in practice. The map label remained abstract, the permit was concrete. Accounts by European travelers in the 18th century sometimes note frustration with delays and inspections. These remarks appear in journals and letters, often as brief observations. They indicate that regulation was effective enough to be noticed, but not exceptional enough to dominate the journey. Waiting at a checkpoint became part of expected travel time. The effectiveness of permission systems depended on repetition. Officials followed the same procedures each day. Travelers learned what was required and prepared accordingly. Over time, the system reduced uncertainty. Unauthorized movement did not disappear, but it became an exception rather than a norm. Routes that required permission also shaped information flow. News traveled along approved paths because messengers followed them. Reports from frontier regions reached capitals through the same corridors used by trade. This reinforced the administrative importance of certain routes over others. A road mattered because it was used and recorded, not because it was the shortest. By the early 19th century, changes in technology and state capacity began to alter these systems, but the underlying principle remained visible. Movement was something to be documented. Routes were channels, not open spaces. Access depended on paper carried by individuals and recognized by officials trained to read it. In later narratives, regulated routes can be reframed as evidence of secrecy or exclusion. The historical record shows a more ordinary picture. Permission was a tool of governance applied broadly and repeatedly. It was not reserved for exceptional cases. It structured daily movement across regions labeled imprecisely as Tartary. The routes themselves endured. Roads worn by caravans remained visible long after administrative systems changed. Passes continued to funnel movement. Rivers continued to require crossings. What changed were the papers required to move along them and the authorities that issued those papers, posts that never advanced. Across Eurasian frontiers, many military posts were not designed to move forward. They were established to remain where they were placed. Their purpose was not expansion but presence. Once built, they became fixed points around which administration and routine gathered. In Russian border regions during the 18th century, forts along defensive lines such as the Orenburg Line or the Siberian lines were positioned according to distance and supply rather than opportunity. Archival descriptions show that these forts were often constructed at intervals that allowed communication by courier within a predictable time. A fort's value lay in its reliability. It was expected to be there the next year, and the year after that, unchanged in position. These posts were supplied through scheduled deliveries. Grain, powder, tools, and clothing arrived according to quotas recorded in ledgers. Shortfalls were noted as logistical problems rather than strategic failures. A fort that ran low on supplies did not advance to secure more territory. It waited for the next delivery or filed a report explaining the deficiency. Personnel assignments reflected this stability. Soldiers were posted for long terms. Some married locally and remained near the fort after their service ended. Clerks, priests, and craftsmen settled nearby because the post created ongoing demand. Over time, small civilian settlements grew beside these installations, not because of conquest, but because the post remained active. In Qing-controlled regions, stationary posts played a comparable role. After the mid-18th century, garrisons were placed in key towns and passes across what is now Xinjiang and Mongolia. The office of the General of Ili oversaw a network of such posts. Their locations were selected to oversee movement rather than to project force outward. Reports sent to the capital describe routine matters: troop numbers, repairs, disciplinary actions, and supply conditions. These garrisons were not isolated. They were connected by relay stations that enabled communication. Messages were passed along fixed routes. A post that received an order was expected to acknowledge it in writing. The emphasis was on confirmation rather than initiative. Deviating from instructions could create confusion across the network. A defining feature of these posts was their refusal to advance. Even when nearby areas were sparsely populated or lightly controlled, the post remained where it was. Authority extended through patrols and administration, not through relocation. The stability of the post allowed surrounding areas to be classified and monitored without physical movement of the garrison. European travelers who encountered such posts often commented on their inactivity. Journals from the 18th and early 19th centuries describe forts that appeared quiet, with limited outward activity. Guards performed regular duties. Flags were raised and lowered according to schedule. From the traveler's perspective, nothing seemed to be happening. From the administrative perspective, this predictability was the goal. The Great Wall system provides an earlier example of this logic. Ming and Qing-era garrisons assigned to wall sections were not expected to move the wall forward. Their responsibility was maintenance and observation. Records list repair quotas, watch schedules, and punishments for absence. Advancement was not part of the role. The wall marked a line to be held, not a starting point for movement. Stationary posts also served as points of reference in legal and administrative documents. A report might describe an incident as occurring 3 days' travel east of the such-and-such fort. Even when surrounding settlements changed, the post remained a stable marker. Its name appeared repeatedly in records across decades. The persistence of these posts complicates later interpretations that emphasize constant movement or collapse. Administrative continuity depended on places that did not shift with political fashion. When borders were renegotiated through treaties, many posts remained in service under revised instructions. Their function adjusted, but their location did not. In areas labeled broadly as Tartaria on European maps, this network of stationary posts provided the practical structure that maps lacked. The map label could stretch or shrink, but the post stayed in place. Its authority derived from recognition by a chain of command, not from cartographic naming. Stationary posts also created archives, daily logs, supply lists, disciplinary records, and correspondence accumulated on site before being forwarded or stored. These documents were written by different hands over long periods, but they followed similar formats. This consistency allows modern historians to trace continuity even when political contexts shifted. The relationship between posts on opposing sides of a border was often regulated rather than hostile. At Kiakta, Russian and Qing officials maintained parallel posts facing each other. Interaction occurred through defined channels, meetings were recorded, disputes were documented and referred upward. The posts themselves did not move closer or farther apart. Their distance was fixed by agreement. When unrest occurred in surrounding regions, stationary posts served as points of retreat and coordination rather than as launch points for pursuit. Orders emphasized holding position and reporting developments. This restraint reflected the value placed on stability over rapid response. An advancing post risked overextension and confusion. Over time, the permanence of these installations shaped local geography. Roads were maintained to reach them. Markets aligned with their supply needs. Populations clustered confirmingly. A post that never advanced nonetheless altered its surroundings simply by remaining. In later periods, when new technologies and administrative reforms reduced the need for such dense networks, some posts were abandoned. Yet their earlier role remains visible in settlement patterns and place names. A town might trace its origin to a fort that existed solely to stay where it was. The historical record treats these posts as ordinary components of governance. They are described without emphasis, noted in reports without commentary. Their significance emerges through repetition. They appear again and again, unchanged in location, performing the same functions across long spans of time. In narratives that search for hidden structures or final defenses, stationary posts can be recast as symbolic. The documents suggest a more practical interpretation. They were tools designed to persist. Their success was measured not by expansion, but by continuity. Records that outlasted the watch. Administrative systems along Eurasian frontiers depended less on the people who staffed them than on the records those people produced. Guards rotated, clerks transferred, commanders died or were reassigned. The paperwork remained. In many cases, it remained longer than the buildings where it was written. Border posts maintained daily logs. These were not narrative accounts. They were tables of presence and absence, weather notes, supply tallies, and confirmations that orders had been received. A typical entry recorded the date, the number of men on duty, and whether anything out of routine occurred. When nothing happened, that absence of event was recorded as well. Silence became part of the archive. At Kiakta, registers tracked movement across the border. Names of merchants, interpreters, and guards appeared repeatedly across years. Variations in spelling were noted, and sometimes corrected in later entries. The consistency of the register mattered more than the individuality of those listed. The book itself was the authority. If a name appeared there, passage had occurred. Treaty obligations were preserved through copied texts stored at multiple locations. The Treaty of Nerchinsk existed in Latin, Russian, and Manchu versions. Each copy was treated as valid within its administrative context. When disputes arose, officials consulted the version recognized by their own chain of command. Marginal notes and later annotations accumulated, indicating how clauses were interpreted in practice. Maps used by administrators were working documents. They were folded, annotated, and corrected. A river bend might be redrawn. A fort symbol might be added or removed. These changes were dated and initialed. The map was not a finished product. It was a surface for ongoing record-keeping. Its value confirms that authority relied on update rather than permanence of design. In Qing frontier administration, memorials sent to the capital followed strict formats. Officials reported troop numbers, supply conditions, and local developments. These memorials were copied and archived. The emperor's responses were also recorded. Over time, these exchanges created layered files that showed continuity of oversight even when individual officials changed. Records also preserved boundaries when markers failed. If a stone was lost or damaged, officials consulted earlier descriptions to determine its original placement. A written distance from a known feature could substitute temporarily for the missing object. This reliance on text over material emphasized the archive's role as a confirmatory reference. Legal authority depended on documentation. In disputes involving unauthorized crossings or trade violations, officials cited registers and permits rather than personal testimony. A person's claim could be overridden by an entry in a book. The book represented prior agreement. Its presence reduced the need for negotiation in each case. Supply records illustrate similar continuity. Forts and posts submitted regular requisitions and receipts. These documents were compared against previous years to identify shortages or irregularities. An unexpected change prompted inquiry. The inquiry generated more paperwork, which joined the existing files. Over time, patterns emerged that outlasted individual observers. The durability of records was supported by copying practices. Important documents were duplicated and sent to regional centers. Copies were compared to originals. Errors were noted. This redundancy reduced the risk of loss. It also meant that authority was dispersed across locations. No single archive held exclusive control. European travelers sometimes gained access to frontier records through official escorts. Their accounts mention being shown registers or maps to explain delays or restrictions. These moments reveal how records functioned as explanations. Officials pointed to paper to justify action. The language of these records was standardized, phrases repeated across years because they were part of approved templates. This repetition was intentional. It minimized ambiguity. A clerk trained in one post could read the records of another without confusion. This shared administrative language linked distant locations. Changes in political control did not immediately erase existing records. When borders shifted through new treaties, earlier documents were often retained for reference. They provided context for renegotiation. A new line might be drawn, but its justification relied on previous descriptions. Continuity was preserved through citation. In regions broadly labelled as Tartary on foreign maps, these archives offered specificity that maps lacked. A map might show a general area. A register showed who passed through a gate on a particular day. The scale differed, but the administrative effect was stronger at the level of the record. The preservation of records required physical care. Archives were stored in designated rooms. Shelves were built. Documents were bundled and labeled. In some posts, fire posed a greater threat than enemy action. Instructions for protecting archives during emergencies appear in administrative manuals, indicating their perceived importance. Over time, the accumulation of records created institutional memory. New officials learned local conditions by reading files rather than relying solely on oral briefings. This reduced dependence on individual experience. The system became self-referential. Past entries guided present action. The endurance of records also shaped later historical understanding. Modern scholars reconstruct confirmation of borders, trade volumes, and administrative practices through surviving documents. Gaps in the archive correspond to disruptions in governance rather than to lack of activity. Where records stop, continuity becomes harder to trace. In contrast to narratives that focus on dramatic events, the record emphasizes routine. Most entries document nothing unusual. Their value lies in repetition. A quiet day recorded is as important as a notable incident. Together, they show how stability was produced. Records did not act alone. They worked alongside markers, posts, and permits. But they persisted when those other elements changed. A fort could be abandoned. A road could shift. The document remained, ready to be consulted. When the watch ended for one generation, the records continued for the next. They provided a baseline against which change could be measured. They did not interpret. They stored. People assigned to stay. Frontier administration depended on individuals whose role was defined by remaining in place. These people were not temporary visitors. Through them, posts, records, and routes acquired continuity that did not rely on constant replacement. In Russian border regions during the 18th century, service populations were deliberately settled near forts and lines. Soldiers stationed along the Siberian and Orenburg lines often served extended terms. Regulations allowed or encouraged marriage, and families were permitted to live near the post. Over time, this created communities whose daily life was tied to the fort's presence rather than to seasonal movement. Clerks formed another stable group. Their work required familiarity with registers, seals, and correspondence practices. Training a new clerk took time, and mistakes carried administrative consequences. As a result, clerks were frequently retained at the same post for long periods. Their handwriting appears repeatedly in surviving documents, sometimes across decades. The continuity of script reflects continuity of assignment. Religious officials also contributed to permanence. In Russian-controlled areas, Orthodox priests were assigned to frontier settlements to serve soldiers and civilians alike. Parish records show baptisms, marriages, and burials conducted over many years in the same location. These records link individual lives to fixed places, reinforcing settlement around the post. In Qing-administered regions, banner garrisons served a similar stabilizing function. After the establishment of Qing control in Xinjiang, bannermen were stationed in designated towns and forts. Their assignment included families, housing, and agricultural support. They were not expected to rotate frequently. Their presence provided a consistent administrative and military layer over local populations. These assignments were formal. Personnel lists recorded names, ranks, and household members. Transfers required approval. Absence without permission was punishable. The expectation was that assigned individuals would adapt to local conditions rather than seek reassignment. This expectation appears repeatedly in administrative correspondence. Interpreters occupied a particularly important role. Along borders such as Kyakhta, communication depended on individuals fluent in multiple languages. Interpreters were scarce and therefore retained. Some interpreters served at the same post for many years, mediating between Russian, Manchu, Mongolian, and Chinese speakers. Their reliability depended on familiarity with local officials as much as on linguistic skill. Artisans and labor specialists were also encouraged to remain. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and armorers supported garrisons by maintaining tools, buildings, and equipment. Their work was continuous rather than episodic. Payment records show regular compensation tied to residence. A skilled artisan, leaving unexpectedly, could disrupt operations more than the loss of a single soldier. In several frontier regions, Hereditary service emerged over time. Sons of soldiers or officials entered service themselves, often at the same post. This was not always mandated, but it was facilitated by proximity and familiarity. Training occurred informally. A child growing up near a fort learned its routines before being formally enrolled. This reduced the need for external recruitment. The same pattern appears in Qing records, where banner households passed obligations across generations. Land allotments, rations, and service duties were inherited. This created long-term stability but also limited mobility. Assignment to stay became a defining feature of identity rather than a temporary condition. Women played a role in maintaining these communities, though they appear less frequently in official documents. Household registers list wives and children. Supply records include provisions for families. Their presence supported permanence by anchoring daily life to the post. Markets, schools, and religious spaces developed because families remained. Civilian populations adjusted accordingly. Merchants, innkeepers, and farmers settled near posts that were known to remain. A stationary post provided predictable demand. A travelling unit did not. Over time, this economic relationship reinforced the post's permanence. The surrounding settlement became part of the administrative landscape. European travellers passing through frontier regions often noted these settled communities. Travel accounts described towns that appeared stable despite their remote location. The observer might remark on orderliness or routine without recognizing that this stability resulted from long-term assignments rather than from natural growth. Assignment to stay also affected discipline. Officials responsible for long-term residence were subject to ongoing evaluation. Annual reviews compared performance against previous years. A temporary assignment might excuse errors as inexperience. A permanent one did not. Continuity increased accountability. In legal matters, long-term residents served as witnesses. Their familiarity with local boundaries, routes, and practices gave weight to their testimony. Courts and administrative inquiries relied on such individuals to establish facts. Health and mortality records further illustrate permanence. Registers note illnesses common to specific locations. Patterns emerge across years. Officials responded by adjusting rations, housing, or duties. These adjustments reflect an assumption that the population would remain and that conditions could be managed over time. The expectation of staying influenced infrastructure. Housing was built for durability rather than for temporary shelter. Storehouses were repaired rather than replaced. Gardens and fields were cultivated. These choices reflect confidence in continued presence. A post meant to advance would not invest in such measures. The broad map labeled Tartary did not account for these local realities. From a distance, the region appeared undefined. On the ground, people were assigned to specific places and expected to remain. Their lives unfolded within fixed administrative frameworks that maps did not convey. Assignment to stay did not eliminate movement entirely. Leaves were granted. Transfers occurred, but these were exceptions managed through paperwork. The default condition was residence. Orders assumed familiarity with local terrain, climate, and population. This assumption only held if people stayed long enough to acquire that knowledge. Over time, these stable populations created informal memory, knowledge of past incidents, boundary changes, or administrative decisions circulated within the community. When new officials arrived, they relied on residents who had been present longer. Oral knowledge supplemented written records. The permanence of people also influenced relations across borders. At paired posts, such as Kiakta, officials on both sides became familiar with their counterparts. Correspondence reflects established working relationships. Disputes were handled through recognized channels rather than through escalation. Familiarity reduced uncertainty. In later periods, reforms sought to professionalize and centralize administration. Some long-term assignments were shortened. Rotation increased. Yet in many frontier areas, the legacy of earlier permanence remained visible in settlement patterns and institutional memory. Historical documents rarely describe these people as guardians. They are identified by rank, duty, and residence. Their significance emerges through accumulation rather than through narrative emphasis. They stayed. That staying allowed systems to function, signals that travelled without troops. Frontier control depended on the movement of information more than the movement of forces. Across Eurasia, Systems developed to transmit instructions, reports, and warnings without relocating large numbers of people. These systems emphasized speed, reliability, and repetition rather than visibility. Relay stations formed the backbone of long-distance communication. In Russian territories, YAM stations were positioned at regular intervals along established routes. Each station maintained fresh horses, basic shelter, and personnel trained to pass messages onward. Couriers carried written orders sealed by authority. Upon arrival, the seal was checked, the time noted, and the message forwarded. The courier did not interpret the contents. His task was delivery. Distances between stations were calculated to balance speed and endurance. A horse could cover a set number of versts before exhaustion. Stations were placed accordingly. Records list expected travel times between points. Delays were noted and explained. Weather, illness, or equipment failure were recorded as causes. The system relied on predictability rather than improvisation. In Qing administration, relay systems known as the Yizhan served a similar purpose. Stations were distributed across imperial territory, including frontier regions. They supported official couriers and provided lodging and supplies according to rank. Manuals specified what each station was required to provide. These requirements were enforced through inspections and reports. Written communication followed standardized formats. Orders were concise. Reports summarized conditions without commentary. The structure allowed rapid reading and reduced ambiguity. An official receiving a document could identify its type and urgency immediately. This efficiency minimized the need for explanation. Flags and visual signals supplemented written communication, particularly for short-range alerts. At forts and wall towers, flags indicated routine states or specific conditions. A raised flag might signal the arrival of a courier. A lowered one might indicate completion of a task. These signals were agreed upon in advance and documented in instructions. Beacon systems existed in earlier periods and continued in modified form. Along the Great Wall, towers were equipped to send smoke or fire signals. Manuals described the materials to be used and the meaning of each signal pattern. One column of smoke might indicate a small incursion. Multiple columns indicated a larger force. The system allowed information to travel faster than any messenger. By the 18th century, such systems were integrated into broader administrative frameworks. A signal did not trigger immediate action on its own. It prompted verification through additional messages. The emphasis remained on confirmation rather than reaction. A false signal could disrupt supply and morale, so accuracy was prioritized. Couriers occupied a defined role within these systems. They were selected for reliability and familiarity with routes. Payment records show compensation tied to distance and difficulty. Couriers were accountable for the condition of the message upon delivery. Damage or loss required explanation. Their work was repetitive and rarely acknowledged beyond the record. Communication across borders followed regulated channels. At Kyakhta, Russian and Qing officials exchanged messages through designated interpreters and messengers. Correspondence was logged on both sides. Copies were retained. The exchange itself became routine. Signals replaced meetings in many cases, reducing the need for physical movement. River signals functioned similarly. On major waterways, flags or markers indicated safe passage, toll collection points, or restrictions. Boat operators learned these signals as part of their trade. Written notices posted at docks reinforced visual cues. Together, they reduced uncertainty for travelers and officials alike. Signals also traveled through sound. Bells, horns, and drums were used within garrisons to mark time and coordinate activity. A confirmatory beat signaled readiness. Silence at an expected hour prompted inquiry. Sound served as an internal signal, aligning daily routines. The reliability of these systems depended on maintenance. Relay stations required supplies. Signal equipment required repair. Manuals emphasized inspection. A broken flagpole or an empty beacon tower undermined the entire chain. Reports addressing such deficiencies appear frequently in administrative correspondence. Information flow shaped decision-making. Orders from capitals were based on reports received through these channels. The speed of communication influenced the type of orders issued. Instructions accounted for delays, An order might specify actions to be taken upon receipt rather than at a fixed date, acknowledging variable transmission times. European observers often underestimated these systems because they lacked visible movement. Travel accounts sometimes describe frontier regions as quiet or inactive. The absence of marching troops was interpreted as absence of control. Administrative records contradict this impression. Messages moved continuously, even when personnel remained stationary. Signals also enforced restraint. Because information traveled independently of force, authorities could issue instructions to hold position rather than advance. A message ordering observation rather than engagement could arrive faster than reinforcements. This capability supported policies favoring stability over expansion. The broad map label, Tartaria, obscured these networks. From a cartographic distance, the region appeared undefined. On the ground, information moved along fixed paths at measured speeds. Authority was exercised through documents and signals rather than through constant physical presence. Errors occurred. Messages were delayed or misunderstood. Systems adapted by adding redundancy. Important orders were sent in duplicate. Separate couriers traveled by different routes. Receipt acknowledgements were required. These practices increased reliability without increasing troop movement. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, technological changes began to alter communication. Improved roads and, later, telegraph lines changed transmission speeds. Yet the earlier systems demonstrate that control did not require mass movement. It required consistent signaling and record-keeping. Signals that traveled without troops allowed confirmation, correction, and restraint. They connected stationary posts, defined routes, and sustained records. Their effectiveness lay in repetition. Each message followed the same path as the last. Each signal meant the same thing as before. The historical record treats these systems as ordinary. They appear in manuals, logs, and correspondence without emphasis. Where information moved reliably, authority could be maintained without visible force. Lines that were not meant to expand. Some boundaries were designed with no expectation of movement. Their purpose was to remain where they were placed and to define an edge that would be maintained rather than pushed outward. These lines appear repeatedly in administrative records as objects of care, repair, and verification, not as starting points for advance. The Great Wall system provides one of the clearest examples. By the Ming period, large sections of the wall were no longer instruments of expansion. They marked limits that were already accepted in practice. Garrison manuals from the 15th and 16th centuries emphasize inspection, maintenance, and signaling. They do not instruct commanders to move the wall forward. Responsibility was defined by assigned stretches that were to be kept in usable condition. Repair quotas were specific. Records list lengths of wall to be maintained by particular units, measured in standardized units. Failure to meet these quotas resulted in penalties. Success did not bring territorial gain. It brought confirmation that the line continued to exist as intended. The wall's function was to persist, not to progress. In later periods, Qing administration treated inherited boundaries similarly. Where the wall or earlier markers existed, they were incorporated into new administrative frameworks. Officials were instructed to maintain what was already present. Reports focused on erosion, structural weakness, and manpower shortages. Advancement beyond the line was not a goal described in routine documentation. Treaty-defined borders followed the same logic. The Treaty of Nerchinsk and later agreements did not describe borders as temporary arrangements awaiting revision through force. They defined lines to be observed and managed. Subsequent correspondence between Russian and Qing officials shows concern with interpretation and maintenance, rather than with alteration. Disputes centered on alignment with existing features, not on shifting the boundary. The physical form of these lines varied. Some were walls, others were rivers, ridges, or surveyed arcs between markers. Their shared characteristic was fixity. Once agreed upon, the line became a reference against which actions were judged. Crossing it, without authorization, was a violation. Remaining on one side of it was compliance. Fortified lines in Russian territories reflect the same principle. The Orenburg Line and related systems consisted of forts connected by patrol zones. These lines were built to hold position. Military instructions emphasized preventing unauthorized entry and monitoring movement. There is little emphasis on advancing the line southward or eastward through routine action. Expansion, when it occurred, was tied to separate campaigns and decisions, not to the daily function of the line. Administrative language reinforces this restraint. Orders instruct garrisons to observe, report, and maintain. Verbs associated with movement appear infrequently in routine contexts. When they do, they refer to patrols within assigned sectors rather than to outward advance. The line defines responsibility. Movement beyond it requires separate authorization. Maps used by administrators reflect this understanding. Boundary lines are drawn with equal weight along their length. There is no visual indication of directionality. The line is an edge, not an arrow. Marginal notes describe conditions along the line rather than opportunities beyond it. The cartographic emphasis aligns with administrative intent. In Qing frontier regions administered under the General of Ely, outer limits were similarly treated. After consolidation in the mid-18th century, the focus shifted to holding defined territory. Garrison placement, agricultural colonies, and supply routes were organized within established bounds. Administrative correspondence emphasizes stability. Expansion beyond these bounds appears in separate military histories, not in routine governance records. The presence of lines that were not meant to expand also shaped expectations of local populations. Communities living near recognized boundaries adjusted activities accordingly. Grazing, trade, and travel were planned with reference to the line. Seasonal movement might approach it, but crossing required permission. The line's permanence reduced uncertainty. European observers sometimes misinterpreted this restraint. Travel accounts occasionally describe frontier lines as evidence of stagnation or weakness. Administrative records suggest a different interpretation. Holding a line required sustained effort. Maintenance consumed resources. The absence of movement reflected policy rather than incapacity. Boundary inspections illustrate this point. Officials were dispatched to walk sections of the line, verify markers, and assess condition. Their reports list measurements, damages, and recommendations. Advancement is not mentioned as a remedy, repair is. The assumption is that the line remains and must be kept legible. These lines also structured diplomacy. When incidents occurred near borders, the response was to consult agreements and markers. Communication referenced the line as a fixed point. Even when tensions rose, correspondence returned to established definitions. The line functioned as a shared reference that limited escalation. In regions broadly labelled as Tartary on European maps, the coexistence of fixed lines and vague cartographic labels created contrast. The map suggested openness. The line enforced closure. Authority resided with the latter. Officials relied on surveyed boundaries and maintained structures rather than on names applied from afar. The administrative cost of maintaining a non-expanding line was ongoing. Materials had to be transported. Labour had to be organised. Weather damage required response. These costs appear regularly in budgets and supply requests. Their repetition indicates acceptance. The line's existence was not questioned each year. Its upkeep was assumed. Legal records further confirm the line's permanence. Jurisdictional disputes were resolved by reference to boundary definitions. A crime committed on one side fell under one authority. On the other side, another. The line did not shift to accommodate convenience. It determined procedure. The idea of a last line can imply finality. The documents show continuity instead. Lines were maintained because they worked within existing administrative capacities. When conditions changed, new lines were negotiated rather than old ones being pushed incrementally. Change occurred through formal processes, not through daily advance. Technological limitations also favoured fixed lines. Communication delays made coordination beyond established boundaries difficult. Supply lines were calibrated to known distances. Extending a line would require recalculation and restructuring. Stability reduced complexity. Over time, some lines lost relevance. New treaties redefined borders. Old walls fell into disuse. Yet during their active periods, these lines were treated as endpoints. Their success was measured by how long they remained effective, not by how far they moved. Historical narratives that emphasize expansion often compress long periods of maintenance into brief transitions. The record shows that most time was spent holding position. Advancement was episodic. Maintenance was continuous. Lines that were not meant to expand served as anchors. They organized administration, constrained movement, and provided reference points for law and diplomacy. Their presence reduced the need for constant decision-making. Once set, they defined routine. The documents describing these lines are repetitive by design. Each inspection resembles the last. Each report follows the same format. This repetition is evidence of intent. The line is meant to persist unchanged. Names that stayed after authority changed. Place names often persist longer than the authorities that once used them. Across Inner Asia and Northern Eurasia, labels recorded on maps, in travel accounts, and in administrative correspondence continued in circulation even as governance shifted. These names did not require enforcement. They remained because they were repeated. The term Tartary illustrates this persistence. European maps from the 16th through the 19th centuries applied variations of the name across large regions. The word itself remained. Cartographers reused it because it was familiar to their audience and because it functioned as a general descriptor for lands beyond detailed administrative knowledge. This persistence did not depend on local adoption. In many cases, the populations living within these regions used different names for their own places and districts. Administrative records from the Russian and Qing states employ specific territorial terms tied to provinces, banners, or lines. They were used for taxation, military assignment, and legal jurisdiction. The broader label existed alongside them, without replacing them. When authority changed, names were often retained for practical reasons. Replacing a name across documents, maps, and correspondence required coordination. Unless a change served an administrative purpose, it was unnecessary. As a result, older names continued in parallel with newer ones. A single location might appear under different labels depending on the source and the intended audience. Travel literature contributed to this continuity. European travelers writing in the 18th century often relied on established geographic terms rather than on current administrative divisions. Their accounts describe journeys through Tartary while noting towns governed by specific states. The general name framed the narrative. The specific names appeared as details within it. Maps produced for different purposes reflect this duality. Atlases intended for general readership favored broad labels. Maps prepared for military or administrative use did not. They replaced generalized names with borders, districts, and routes. The coexistence of these map types allowed names to persist without governing authority. The same pattern appears with other regional terms. Names such as Turkestan or Manchuria appear before, during, and after shifts in control. Their meaning changes subtly over time, but the word remains in circulation. It adapts to new contexts rather than disappearing. Administrative correspondence sometimes acknowledges this gap. Officials clarify which area is meant when a commonly used name is ambiguous. The clarification does not challenge the name's existence. It limits its application within a specific document. Precision is achieved through explanation rather than through renaming. Place names also persisted through translation. A name recorded in one language might be transliterated into another without alteration of its core sound. Over time, these transliterations solidified into accepted forms. The process detached the name from any single administrative system. It became a linguistic artifact. Local usage further reinforced continuity. Markets, caravan routes, and customary references relied on names known to participants. Changing a name could disrupt recognition. As long as the name functioned in daily exchange, it remained useful. Administrative authority adapted to that reality by acknowledging common usage in communication. Even when states sought to standardize nomenclature, older names did not vanish immediately. New terms appeared in official documents. Older ones persisted in informal contexts. Over time, the balance shifted. The process was gradual. Records show overlap rather than replacement. In border regions, names often served as neutral ground. Using a broad regional term could avoid endorsing a specific claim. Diplomatic correspondence sometimes favored such terms when discussing contested areas. The name allowed reference without commitment. Its vagueness was functional. The endurance of names also reflects the limits of administrative reach. Authority could enforce rules within defined jurisdictions. It could not easily regulate language beyond official contexts. A map printed in another country or a travel account written for a foreign audience lay outside direct control. Names used there followed different incentives. Historians tracing these names encounter layers rather than sequences. A name does not belong to a single period. It accumulates meanings across time. Understanding its use requires attention to context. A label on a 17th century map does not carry the same implications as the same label in a 19th century gazetteer. This layered usage complicates later interpretation. Names can be mistaken for evidence of unified governance or shared identity. Administrative records contradict such assumptions. They show multiple systems operating within areas labeled by a single term. The name persists, authority varies. Educational materials contributed to this persistence. School atlases and encyclopedias reproduced familiar terms. Updating them lagged behind political change. A name learned in one generation could persist into the next, even after its administrative relevance declined. The replacement of names, when it occurred, followed formal processes. Treaties, decrees, and administrative reforms introduced new terminology. Their adoption in broader usage took longer. During that interval, old and new names coexisted. In some cases, names confirm continuity of roots rather than of rule. A caravan road might retain its traditional name, regardless of which state administered the surrounding territory. Merchants referred to the route by name because it conveyed practical information. Authority adjusted around that usage. The map label Tartary eventually fell out of favor in mainstream cartography. Its decline coincided with increased European access to administrative information and more detailed mapping. The name did not disappear abruptly. It faded as alternatives became standard. This pattern underscores a distinction between naming and governing. Names circulate through habit, education, and publication. Governance operates through orders, records, and enforcement. The two intersect, but do not align perfectly. A name can remain long after authority changes. For contemporary viewers examining historical maps, this persistence can be misleading. A stable label can suggest a stable entity. The administrative record shows otherwise. Stability of name does not equal stability of control. Names that stayed after authority changed provide evidence of continuity in perception rather than in administration. They reveal how regions were understood from a distance. They also show how language can outlast policy. The record does not treat this persistence as remarkable. It appears incidentally through repeated use. Its significance emerges through accumulation. Each reuse extends the name's life. In later periods, new authorities confirmed their presence through documents, markers, and posts. Names followed more slowly. The delay created overlap. That overlap remains visible in surviving sources. Understanding this distinction helps separate cartographic convention from administrative fact. Names belong to one layer of the record, authority belongs to another. Both must be read together. Boundaries that became administrative habits. Once a boundary had been marked and recorded, its continued existence depended on repetition. The line was not reaffirmed through ceremony each year. It was reaffirmed through routine use. Officials acted as if it existed, and that behavior made the boundary real in daily administration. At border posts, this habit appeared in paperwork. Registers were organized according to jurisdiction. Entries were filed under headings that assumed the line's presence. A report described an event as occurring on one side or the other without restating why that division existed. The boundary became an unspoken premise rather than a topic. Customs procedures illustrate this process. At regulated crossings such as Kiakta, officials inspected goods according to rules tied to location. Duties applied on one side of the line and not the other. The act of inspection did not question the boundary. It relied on it. Over time, the repeated application of these rules normalized the division. Patrol routines reinforced habit in the landscape. Units were assigned sectors defined by distance from a post or marker. Patrol logs record movement within these sectors. The absence of entries describing movement beyond assigned limits suggests that such movement was not routine. The line shaped daily paths without requiring constant attention. In Qing administration, banner jurisdictions functioned similarly. Duties were assigned within defined areas. Reports summarized conditions within those areas. When an issue involved movement across jurisdictions, correspondence focused on coordination rather than on redefining limits. The boundary-structured response. Legal cases further demonstrate normalization. When disputes arose involving grazing, hunting, or trade near borders, officials referred to established jurisdiction. The question was not where the boundary lay, but which authority applied. This presumes acceptance. The boundary had become a legal habit. Inspection schedules contributed to this effect. Officials walked or rode sections of the boundary at set intervals. Their reports follow consistent formats. They list condition, markers present or absent, and any required repairs. The purpose was maintenance, not reassessment. The act of inspection treated the boundary as settled. Language in administrative documents reflects this stability. Verbs associated with upkeep appear frequently. Words associated with negotiation or alteration appear rarely in routine contexts. When they do appear, they are tied to specific incidents or higher-level directives. Habit dominates vocabulary. The training of personnel reinforced these assumptions. New officials learned procedures that incorporated boundaries as given facts. Manuals described how to act at borders, not how to decide where borders should be. Instruction focused on compliance. Questioning the line lay outside routine duty. Economic activity adapted accordingly. Merchants planned routes and schedules with reference to known jurisdictions. Markets aligned with border procedures. The predictability reduced risk. Over time, this economic reliance further stabilized the boundary's role. Changing it would disrupt established practice. Communication systems also embedded boundaries. Messages were addressed to offices defined by jurisdiction. Reports were routed according to location. A message originating on one side followed a different administrative path than one from the other. The line directed information flow. In regions broadly labeled as Tartaria on distant maps, this habitual structure provided clarity absent from cartography. While the label suggested openness, daily practice enforced division. Officials did not need to consult maps to know where authority changed. Habit supplied that knowledge. The persistence of habit is visible in moments of disruption. When markers were damaged or posts temporarily abandoned, administration often continued as if the boundary remained. Temporary uncertainty did not immediately alter practice. Habit filled gaps until material confirmation was restored. Correspondence during such disruptions emphasizes continuity. Officials wrote about restoring markers to their proper place, implying a known location. They did not propose new alignments. The boundary's prior existence guided action. International diplomacy relied on this habituation. When incidents occurred near borders, both sides referred to established practice. The language of protest or clarification assumed shared understanding. Habit reduced ambiguity and limited escalation. Even when new treaties adjusted boundaries, administrative habits influenced implementation. Old routines did not vanish overnight. Transition instructions addressed how to shift practices gradually. Overlap periods are visible in records, where old and new procedures coexist. The durability of habit also explains why some boundaries persisted despite limited physical enforcement. A line might lack continuous fortification, yet still function effectively. Officials acted consistently. Travelers complied. The boundary existed in behavior as much as in structure. Education played a role. Clerks learned geography through administrative use, rather than through abstract study. Knowing which office handled which area mattered more than knowing a map's full extent. This practical knowledge reinforced boundaries through daily work. Religious and social institutions adapted similarly. Parishes, schools, and community organizations aligned with administrative divisions. Records of births, marriages, and deaths followed jurisdictional lines. Social life mirrored governance. Over time, boundaries influenced identity in subtle ways. People referred to themselves as belonging to one district rather than another. This identification was administrative rather than ideological. It arose from interaction with officials, taxes, and services. Habit shaped perception. European observers sometimes fail to notice this internalization. Travel accounts focus on visible markers or the lack thereof. Administrative habit leaves fewer physical traces. It appears in documents rather than in monuments. The decline of certain labels and the rise of others did not immediately affect these habits. When cartographic terms changed, administrative routines often continued unchanged. The boundary's effectiveness depended on practice, not on name. In some cases, boundaries outlasted the states that created them. Successor administrations inherited routines along with lines. Adopting existing habits reduced administrative cost. Continuity was practical. Records show few moments where boundaries were actively contested in daily administration. Most conflict occurred at higher levels or during specific events. Routine life assumed stability. Habit prevailed. This habituation explains why borders could be maintained with limited force. Enforcement relied on expectation. When people expect a rule to exist, compliance increases. Administrative habit fostered that expectation. The process was gradual. A boundary did not become habitual immediately. It required repeated application across years. Each inspection, register entry, and patrol reinforced it. Eventually, the line no longer needed explanation. Understanding this process shifts attention from origins to maintenance. Boundaries persisted because they were used. Their continued use made them ordinary. That ordinariness is visible in the record's tone. Documents rarely announce that a boundary has become accepted. They simply proceed as if it has. Acceptance appears through omission. The absence of debate indicates success. This pattern holds across regions and administrations discussed under broad labels like Tartaria. Despite variation in governance, the method remains similar. Habit transforms agreement into routine. The historical record emphasizes procedure over proclamation. Boundaries became administrative habits through repetition, not through declaration. Their stability lay in daily practice, watchfulness without expansion. Observation along established borders did not require constant motion. It required attention applied consistently over time. Frontier systems relied on watching rather than advancing, on noting rather than acting. This form of watchfulness appears throughout administrative records as routine rather than response. Garrisons were instructed to observe surroundings within defined limits. Patrols followed scheduled routes. The purpose was familiarity. Knowing what normally occurred made deviation visible. Patrol logs reflect this intent. Entries record weather, terrain condition, and ordinary encounters. The absence of unusual activity is often noted explicitly, confirming that observation took place. Lookouts and towers served as fixed points for surveillance. Their placement favored visibility over reach. A tower did not need to see far into neighboring territory. It needed to see consistently within its assigned field. Manuals describe watch schedules divided by hours. Guards rotated to avoid fatigue. Continuity was preserved through overlap rather than urgency. Reports produced by these watch systems were concise. A report stating that no change had occurred carried administrative value. It confirmed that the system was functioning. Repetition of such reports across weeks and months established baseline conditions. Deviations could then be identified against that baseline. In Qing frontier regions, observation duties were distributed among banner units and local officials. Instructions emphasized restraint. Observers were to record movement, not pursue it without authorization. This distinction appears repeatedly in correspondence. The goal was awareness, not engagement. Russian border administration followed similar principles. Instructions to line commanders stress reporting rather than reaction. Movement across a boundary without permission was to be noted and referred upward. Immediate pursuit was discouraged unless explicitly ordered. This policy limited escalation and preserved stability. Observation extended beyond military matters. Officials watched trade flows, seasonal movement, and settlement patterns. Reports include counts of caravans, livestock crossings, and temporary encampments near borders. These details were not dramatic. They were statistical. Over time, they revealed trends without prompting immediate action. The effectiveness of watchfulness depended on familiarity with routine. A guard stationed long enough to know regular patterns could identify anomalies. This reinforced the earlier emphasis on long-term assignment. Observation was cumulative. Each day added context to the next. Written reports followed templates, headings guided content, deviations from format were corrected. This standardization ensured that information from different posts could be compared. It also limited interpretation. Observers recorded what they saw, not what they thought it meant. Surveillance also involved listening. Sounds of movement, animal activity, or human presence were noted. At night, guards recorded whether expected sounds were present. Silence, where noise was typical, could prompt further observation. These details appear in logs without commentary. Communication systems supported watchfulness. Observations were forwarded through relay networks. Higher authorities compiled reports from multiple posts. Patterns emerged across regions. A single observation mattered less than its repetition across locations. This aggregation allowed oversight without movement of troops. Maps, annotated by officials, sometimes include notes derived from observation. A trail used regularly appears darker over time. A crossing used infrequently remains lightly marked. These annotations reflect accumulated watching rather than survey expeditions. The map evolves through observation. European travelers occasionally mistook this restraint for neglect. Travel accounts describe quiet borders with little visible activity. Administrative records contradict this impression. Watching does not always appear active. Its success lies in uneventful continuity. Watchfulness also shaped response protocols. When unusual activity was observed, the first step was confirmation. Additional observation was ordered. Reports were compared. Only after confirmation did instructions change. This layered approach reduced false alarms and unnecessary movement. Legal frameworks reinforced observational restraint. Unauthorized action by guards could lead to disciplinary review. Records include cases where individuals exceeded instructions by pursuing or detaining without authorization. Penalties emphasize adherence to observation roles. Authority lay in reporting, not in acting independently. The emphasis on watching rather than advancing also conserved resources. Maintaining fixed posts and patrols required fewer supplies than constant movement. Budget records reflect this preference. Funds were allocated for maintenance and reporting infrastructure rather than for expansionary campaigns. Seasonal variation influenced observation practices. Winter reduced movement and visibility. Reports adjust accordingly. Summer increased patrol frequency. These adjustments appear in schedules rather than in directives. Observation adapted to conditions without altering boundaries. In regions labeled broadly as Tartary by external observers, this watchfulness created internal order, invisible from a distance. The absence of expansion did not indicate absence of control, it indicated a system designed to maintain rather than to grow. Surveillance extended to internal behavior. Officials monitored compliance among their own personnel. Absences, negligence, and procedural errors were recorded. Watching applied inward as well as outward. This internal surveillance reinforced consistency. The language of observation in records is restrained. Verbs describe seeing, noting, and recording. Emotional or evaluative language is rare. This tone reflects intent. Observation was meant to inform, not to persuade. Over time, accumulated observations formed archives of normalcy. When later historians examine these records, the monotony itself becomes evidence. Stability appears through repetition. Change appears as interruption. Watchfulness without expansion also limited the scope of conflict. By defining observation as the primary duty, authorities reduced opportunities for unilateral action. This policy appears in both Russian and Qing contexts. It reflects shared administrative logic rather than shared ideology. When expansion did occur, it followed separate decision-making channels. Campaigns required authorization, planning, and resources beyond routine observation. Their records are distinct. They do not blend with daily logs. This separation reinforces the non-expansionary role of watch systems. Observation practices also extended to environmental conditions. Floods, fires, and erosion near boundaries were reported. These observations informed maintenance rather than territorial adjustment. The boundary remained. The environment around it was managed. The training of observers emphasized accuracy. Manuals instruct guards to record facts plainly. Exaggeration was discouraged. False reports undermined trust in the system. Accuracy sustained credibility. The persistence of these practices across decades suggests institutional commitment. Watchfulness was not an interim measure, it was a long-term strategy. Its success depended on patience rather than on force. The record does not celebrate watchfulness, it assumes it. Observation appears as background activity supporting all other functions. In later periods, new technologies altered observation methods. Optical instruments, improved communication, and centralized reporting changed scale and speed. Yet the underlying principle remained. Watching precedes action. Understanding this emphasis clarifies why borders could remain stable without constant movement. Authority was exercised through attention and documentation. Expansion was unnecessary for maintenance. Watchfulness without expansion produced predictability. Predictability reduced conflict. Reduced conflict reinforced the boundary's acceptance. This cycle appears repeatedly in the record. The documents do not frame this as strategy, they frame it as procedure. That distinction matters. Strategy implies choice. Procedure implies routine. Stability was procedural. This form of watchfulness concludes the functional pattern. Markers fixed the line. Routes controlled movement. Posts remained in place. Records preserved continuity. People stayed. Signals moved information. Lines held. Names persisted. Habits formed. Watching maintained all of it without expansion. What remained when the label faded? By the early 19th century, the broad cartographic label that had once covered large portions of northern and inner Asia appeared less frequently on new maps. Its decline coincided with changes in European geographic knowledge, expanded surveying, and closer diplomatic contact with states administering those regions. The disappearance of the label did not coincide with the disappearance of administrative practice on the ground. Official documents continued without interruption. Border registers remained in use. Patrol logs were written in the same formats. Customs records listed weights, counts, and names. The absence of a familiar external name did not alter the internal routines that governed movement, taxation, and oversight. Administration proceeded as before, guided by procedure rather than by terminology. Maps produced for state use reflect this continuity. As generalized labels were replaced with more specific district names, the underlying structures remained visible. Lines drawn earlier were retained or adjusted according to new agreements. Posts already in place continued to serve as reference points. Updates reflected refinement rather than replacement. Treaty frameworks persisted as well. Agreements such as Nerchinsk and Kyakhta continued to be cited in correspondence long after their signing. Officials referred to clauses, precedents, and established interpretations. Later, negotiations built upon earlier texts. The legal memory embedded in these documents outlasted the vocabulary used by foreign cartographers. Administrative geography became more granular. Provinces, banners, districts, and counties appeared more prominently in records. This shift increased precision without disrupting routine. Clerks filed documents under updated headings. Patrol assignments were redefined by smaller units. The change affected classification, not function. Border maintenance remained a daily task. Markers were inspected, posts were repaired, reports continued to note weather damage and erosion. These activities did not require a regional label. They required location, distance, and responsibility. The work remained localized and procedural. The same applies to regulated movement. Permits, passes, and registers continued to govern travel. Documents issued under one naming convention were replaced by those under another, but the requirement to carry paper did not change. Travelers adapted to the new forms. Officials checked seals and signatures as before. Economic records show continuity as well. Trade flows adjusted to new tariffs and routes, but the mechanisms of control persisted. Customs houses remained active. Account books list commodities and quantities with consistent structure. Changes in nomenclature appear in headings rather than in practice. Garrisons and service communities remained in place. Families continued to live near posts. Parish and household records extended across decades. These populations did not relocate when a map label faded. Their lives were organized around posts, markets, and fields that continued to exist. Communication networks persisted. Relay stations remained spaced along routes. Couriers carried messages under revised administrative names. Receipt acknowledgements and timestamps continued to be recorded. Information moved independently of external naming conventions. Legal authority followed jurisdiction rather than label. Courts handled cases based on location and applicable law. Records cite districts and offices, not broad regions. The removal of a generalized name did not affect jurisdictional boundaries recognized by administrators. European travel accounts from the 19th century reflect this transition. Writers increasingly use specific place names encountered in official documents. References to older regional labels declined. The journeys themselves followed established routes. Checkpoints, inspections, and delays remained familiar features. Educational materials changed more slowly. Some atlases and encyclopedias continued to include older terms alongside newer ones. This overlap reflects the lag between administrative change and popular knowledge. The presence or absence of a term in print did not alter governance. The persistence of administrative habit is visible in the handling of disputes. When incidents occurred near borders, officials relied on established procedures. Reports cite earlier cases and instructions. Resolution followed known paths. The process did not require reinterpretation of regional identity. Archives provide evidence of this continuity. Files from different periods align in format and content. Changes appear incremental. New headings are added. Old ones are crossed out. The sequence of documents shows adaptation rather than rupture. Environmental management also continued. Flood control, road repair, and resource monitoring were recorded within existing administrative frameworks. These tasks required local knowledge and sustained attention. Their execution did not depend on how a region was labeled externally. The decline of a label also reflects changes in information flow. Improved surveying and state reporting reduced reliance on generalized terms. Specificity increased. This shift benefited administrators by aligning external representations more closely with internal divisions. Language used within administration illustrates the same trend. Terms became standardized within each state. Transliteration practices stabilized. Ambiguity decreased. Communication became more efficient. The process is visible in correspondence that corrects earlier vague references with precise ones. The fading of a label did not erase historical memory. Earlier documents continued to be consulted. Maps with older terminology remained in archives. Officials understood how past descriptions related to present arrangements. This awareness supported continuity. In some cases, older names persisted in informal usage. Local populations and travelers might continue to use familiar terms. Administrators acknowledged this in communication by clarifying meaning rather than by enforcing language change. The relationship between naming and authority becomes clearer in this context. Authority operated through enforcement, record-keeping, and routine. Naming facilitated communication, but did not constitute control. The two intersected but were not equivalent. When new political arrangements emerged, they inherited existing structures. Adopting established posts, routes, and records reduced administrative burden. Continuity offered efficiency. This pragmatic approach appears in transition documents that emphasize preservation of function. The record does not treat the fading of a label as an event requiring response. There are no directives announcing its removal. The change appears indirectly. Through absence, new documents simply do not use the term. Routine continues. Historians examining these materials can trace continuity through practice rather than through terminology. The absence of a name does not signal absence of structure. The presence of routine signals persistence. In regions once grouped under broad labels, diversity of administration becomes more visible as specificity increases. Different districts followed similar procedures adapted to local conditions. The shared method, not the shared name, defined governance. The durability of administrative systems explains why change in representation did not produce disruption. Boundaries had become habits. Observation had become routine. Records had accumulated. People had settled. These elements did not depend on external naming. Maps eventually aligned more closely with administrative reality. As generalized labels disappeared, specific borders and names filled the space. This alignment reflects convergence between representation and practice, rather than the creation of new structures. The process also reveals limits of cartography. Maps summarize. Administration details. When the two diverge, practice prevails. The fading of a label demonstrates this hierarchy. What remained when the label faded were procedures, records, and routines. They continued to operate because they were embedded in daily work. Their persistence required no explanation. The archival trail shows continuity without emphasis. The work carried on. Files grew. Posts remained. Movement was regulated. Observation continued. The absence of a name did not require replacement in practice. Understanding this persistence shifts attention from terminology to operation. Governance is maintained through repetition. Names assist, but do not sustain it. The record ends each day without commentary. Another entry follows. The sequence of chapters reflects that pattern. Each element supports the next. None depends on a single label. Together, they describe an administrative world that functioned through routine. What remained was not a mythic entity or a vanished power. It was a set of practices observable in documents and structures. Their continuity is measurable. The fading of a label marks a change in representation. The persistence of practice marks stability. The historical material preserves that distinction without interpretation. It records what continued to be done. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this. Feel free to leave a comment below. See you next time.